All right, so we're doing well? I'm really excited to be here for a number of reasons. First of all, I've heard a lot about this event over the years, and I've always wanted to come to it, and I'm really appreciative to Sharon and Jeremy for inviting me. And secondly, I've never been to Tel Aviv before, and I spent the day walking around yesterday with a friend of mine who's Israeli, and this is an amazing city. So thank you for making me feel welcome in your city. So as a little bit of background, I'm really passionate about how we build communities. I served as director of community for the Ubuntu project at Canonical, at GitHub and XPRIZE. I've written a book for O'Reilly, I write for Forbes, and I run this event called the Community Leadership Summit, where community managers come together. But these days, I'm a consultant. I work with companies to help them build community strategy around what they want to accomplish, typically around a product or a service that's public, but often inside as well. And one of the reasons why I did this is that I wanted to expose myself to problems that I'd never experienced before, right? So I'd spent years working in open source, but I wanted to work with financial services and consumer products and other things. And what I've learned from this is a consistent set of common problems and very different ways in which we solve them. So today, we're really talking about DevOps, right? And when we think about this, what we often see is this, right? We see this kind of DevOps workflow that manifests itself in a multitude of different formats. And what this is really about, in my mind, is about bridging two very different cultures, right? So you get developers and ops who operate in related ways, but different ways. And how do we bridge these in a way where people can be more effective in the way in which they build and deliver software? But when we think about this, and we think about the different groups and the different cultures that are involved in building or delivering a service, it's not just devs and ops. We also have product. You know, what does this thing look like? And how do we build it? And how do we solicit our customers' feedback? We have design and UX, which I think is critical to the success of any product or service. We have marketing, to get it out there and build awareness about it and channel leads for sales. And then, of course, we have sales who will go out and sell it and, drink a lot of champagne and generally annoy everybody else in this chain. I'm being mean to salespeople, but that's because I've met a lot of salespeople. But anyway, we have all of these different cultures who are involved. And the businesses that succeed are the ones that are able to bridge how they work and how they operate. These are very different groups of people. And typically when we think about this, we tend to focus on what are the common agreements, right, in how we operate. So in software terms, the way in which we get different bits of software to work together is we build APIs. And we have common standards of APIs, and that helps software to communicate together. So we have that kind of culturally in these different groups, but then we also talk about what software and tools can we use to kind of help these different groups to work well together. But in my mind, one of the things that's often missed out here, and what I want to talk about today, is what is the psychology of this, right? We are all animals. When you take away the computers and the screens and this thing that changes the slides, we're basically animals, and we all have a very consistent set of fears, ideas, desires, all these different elements. And I want to talk about this a little bit and how we can harness this in the DevOps world. So psychologically, we think we're pretty rational people, right? You sit there, you go to work, you interpret the world around you, and you make good decisions based upon the information that you've got available to us. But in reality, we're actually completely irrational, and we don't like to admit this. If we were rational human beings, we wouldn't drink too much alcohol. We know it's bad for us. We wouldn't do drugs. We wouldn't eat crappy fast food. We'd save for retirement. We'd do all of these things, or we'd avoid these things because we understand the risks, and we would avoid the risks and we'd optimize for the successes. But in reality, we don't do that. We go out, we get drunk, and then we drive through some horrible fast food place afterwards. We don't save for retirement because you know what? There's that new PS4 game just came out, right? That's how it tends to work. What's interesting is that this irrationality that we all experience is actually predictable. Because what happens is we're irrational in very, very consistent ways. And this is what I find fascinating about this. So this is the study of something called behavioral economics. Is anyone familiar with this science? Few people? This is pretty much about what's usually when I've talked about this beforehand. So behavioral economics is fascinating. And let me give you a few examples of this. Is anyone familiar with these signs, right? So they put these signs up in Scotland. And the idea is that you know the speed that you're going, and if you're going too fast, you see the speed and you slow down. Now, the Scots saw this more of a competition than a deterrent. And they go as fast as they could. Now, when they changed this to a frowny face, accidents went down, the speed went down. And it's because it solicits this empathy reflex, so we just react to it fairly consistently. IKEA. If I went out and bought an IKEA table and Jeremy bought exactly the same IKEA table, we both made it, he would think his was better, and I would think mine was better, because we overvalue our own creations. This has massive implications for open source projects, where people submit pull requests and they think that it's really good, and it's actually kind of shitty, and people don't particularly like it, and it can cause a lot of issues. There was some interesting research done about tax returns, that if you go and fill in a tax return, and then you sign your name at the bottom, people would often fiddle their expenses a little bit, or they'd lie a little bit on the form. But when you sign your name at the top, and then you fill in exactly the same form, people are way more honest. And that's because we cherish our identity, and therefore it impacts our behavior when we go through it. So these are the kind of things that kind of tend to map out in behavioral economics. And there's hundreds of these kinds of examples. The question is why? Why do we do this? Why is this like weird behavior pretty consistent? And the reason why is that the majority of us have one of these in our heads. Some people's a lot smaller than other people's, and some people don't use it. Look at American politics as one example of that. And there's this guy called Daniel Kahneman, and he talked about, we can think about two types of thinking. One is called system one thinking, and this is your just animal, thousands of years old kind of element in your brain, which is if I'm looking for a tiger in the bush, or if someone jumped up to me right now, and my reaction, that would be the system one part of my brain. I'd be freaked out. Your system two part of the brain is your conscious, rational thought. There's this guy who I'm a huge fan of called Rory Sutherland. He's one of the most English people you can ever see on YouTube, you know. And he says that the system two part of your brain is like the press office for the system one, and it's explaining away all the ridiculous decisions that system one is trying to get away with. The behavioral economics, the predictable, irrational behavior that we have, is driven by system one. You can't change it because it's put in your brain so we survive, right? When we weren't in convention centers and we were running around with spears trying to not be eaten by a woolly mammoth, okay? What's fascinating to me about this is that when we understand this psychology, it provides a scaffolding for how we build interesting things. One of the things that I've wrestled with for years, you know, I've spent, I think, about 20 years working in community management and leadership. And the reason why I've focused on this is that I just find it an incredibly interesting topic. Like, how do we get people to collaborate effectively together and build amazing things? And I think that when we crack that, you make the world a better place. We all know this. The reason why we're all sat in this room is because we know the power of us working together is more effective than any individual, right? We strengthen each other. But the problem is that how we work well together and how we build communities has always been a bit of a mystery. And I'd spent my career trying to figure out all the patterns and recognizing the little tricks and techniques for building communities. So when I discovered behavioral economics, I thought, this is actually a blueprint that we can use for some of this stuff. Now, the problem here is there's loads of books on this. You can go out, you can buy a ton of them. There's a guy called Dan Ariely. He's kind of the godfather of behavioral economics, you know, kind of. Yeah, everyone loves Ariely. He's amazing. And when I say godfather, I don't mean mafiosi-style godfather. I mean, like, you know, he's just been around, done a lot of this. And but it's pretty heavy reading, and sometimes it can be very difficult to map this to what we do. You know, so my IKEA table example is probably the simplest of that, because we can map that to collaboration. But the tax return example, what does that mean in our world? So today I want to walk through 5 principles that I think are really interesting, that I think relate to DevOps. And as I go through this, think about how this applies to your world. and try to zoom out from the specifics of what you do and the technology that you do, and think about how these principles can map to the different groups of people that you tend to work with, okay? Now, there's loads of principles, but I'm going to focus on 5, and then if we've got time, we'll have a bit of Q&A. We can delve into some others. Number 1, simple, clear, predictable direction. There's this kind of view in the world that there are 2 types of people. We have leaders and followers, right? And the leaders are the people who can crush through any kind of adversity, that when they face challenges, they'll figure it out. And I think that's largely true. But the majority of people, and a lot of the people in this room, are followers. We need guardrails. We need a blueprint. We need a recipe book. The greatest chefs in the world can just take 17 ingredients and make something that tastes delicious. But for the rest of us, we need a cookbook. Okay? And I think it's easy to forget this when you're surrounded, like this room is filled with really smart people, and it can be easy to forget that smart people tend to presume that other people are smart, and therefore we don't need as much clear direction, but we all need it. So this goes back to this, right? We've developed these kind of methodologies and workflows for how we build and deploy software in different ways. But in reality, everything that we have in the world needs a clear on-ramp. Right? So this is something I talk about a lot with my clients and with communities, is when somebody joins a community, we want to have somebody who goes from, I don't really know what you're doing, to how can I contribute something that is tangibly valuable, right? So in a software context, such as an open source project, the tangible first contribution is typically a pull request, okay? And in almost every community that I've ever worked on, there's 6 components that tend to map for how do you go from someone who doesn't know anything about what you're doing to contributing that first piece of value. The first step is why? Why should I take my time for this? The world is becoming increasingly difficult to get people's attention, right? So there's millions and millions of things vying for our attention every day, and our communication has become bite-sized. This is the impact that social media's had. So, we're communicating little nuggets of text. It's not just Twitter, but Slack has fueled this significantly as well. So how do we participate, and how do we get those people? Then how do we set up the tools that we need to do something? I remember one open source project that I worked with once. It took about 3 hours to set up your tool chain. Unacceptable. If it takes that long, you've already lost them. There was a principle in the 90s in the software world called the shrink wrap gap, which is that from unwrapping the boxed piece of software to doing something interesting, you had 10 minutes. And I think we need to think about this when it comes to this on-ramp. The third element is, how do you build skills? How do people learn what to do? If you're going to submit a pull request, how do you understand the code base? How do you build the thing? How do you understand the code base? How do you contribute it? What are the coding guidelines? All those things. So many projects think they'll figure it out. And then what you get is crappy pull requests. The fourth element is doing something. So then you need to know, what do I work on? And then the fifth element is, how do I solve problems? Everybody's going to face a problem. It doesn't matter how good your documentation is. People are going to have questions. So how do people ask questions and get good answers? The sixth element here then is, when you've done something, how do you validate it? How do you make that person feel good about it? Now, you'll notice in this that 1 and 6 have an extra bonus circle wrapped around it. And that's because every single on-ramp for anything you do, whether it's building an open source project, whether it's joining a new company, whether it's buying a car, everyone needs to understand, why should I do this? And then they need to have a sense of gratification at the end of it. And these 2 pieces are critical. And one of the reasons for this is that we don't just need clear direction, but everybody needs validation. I discovered this when I had my first crappy boss, right? This guy who I worked with was useless. He wasn't very fun. I think he was a skeleton just wrapped in disappointment, okay? And he never validated anything. Like, I would do stuff, and I craved his approval. And the best managers in the world, the best colleagues in the world always validate you. They tell you, oh, that was great, or that, we could improve this. Everybody needs that. I don't care how smart or accomplished you are, everybody needs that. So we should think about that, how we apply that to our onboarding. The other element here is very clear and open and collaborative tracking. So when you do have a piece of work that you're going to work on together, and this is very important when you're crossing cultures such as DevOps and with marketing and sales and whatever else, is that you can track that in a way that everybody's got access to it. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on. That asynchronous workflow, I think, is really critical. Number 2, second pattern principle. Choice and collaboration is really important to us. This is a really fundamental behavioral economics principle, right? So if you look at the way that our culture is evolving, years ago, people worked in these, right? You'd go to work, you'd sit in a cube, and psychologically and physically, you'd be operating in your box. And that was normal, right? You would be given your list of things you had to do, and you'd use your approved list of software to do those things, and you'd follow the approved methodology and process for doing that. And you basically operate in that way. Today, it's different. Kids that are growing up today are growing up in a world where they can go and have access to 1 million different open source projects, where you can be in the middle of nowhere and you can contribute something that's valuable. When I was working at Canonical, I've told this story hundreds of times, so some of you may have heard of this. About 6 months into my new job at Canonical, running the Ubuntu community, I got an email from a kid who's based in Africa. And he said to me, he's just gushing with passion about Ubuntu, because Ubuntu is an ancient African word in Africa, and it means humanity towards others. And he said that he would work all week. He'd kind of do chores around his village, and then he'd go to on a weekend he'd spend 2.5 hours walking to his local town. He would spend that money on internet access. He could usually buy about an hour's worth of internet access. He'd contribute to Ubuntu, and then he'd walk 2.5 hours back. And what blew me away about this was that he was passionate, and the work that he did, he felt like he could play a role in doing something that was meaningful. And we all want that, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. But he had the choice. He had the ability to do that. It wasn't just this specific type of person can participate. So we're seeing this increasingly commonly in recruiting. One of the things that I always talk to my clients about is if you don't figure out a way of building communities in your business, you're not going to be able to hire people. People don't want to sit in these anymore. So we're going to start, even if you physically sit in a cube, people want to be able to collaborate and have choice in the way that they work together. Now, one of the things I've learned as a consultant, I'm embarrassed to be a consultant because there are awful consultants out there. And consultants will either go to a company and they'll solve real problems, but they won't teach them anything. So then the company becomes dependent on that consultant, and they charge the completely overblown rates. Or the consultant will go to a company, they'll teach them a load of stuff, but they won't solve any real problems. And I try to do both. I try to teach people and solve real problems. But one of the challenges that I faced early in was, how do I get my clients to take the guidance that I'm giving them? And one of the things I learned from this is, if you basically go away and give them a set of, this is what we're going to do, they'll ignore it. People, if they're involved in the process and they're formulating the decision-making around what you're going to do, if you're working together on it, they're way more likely to incorporate that. So when we think about how we build strategy and roadmaps and planning, we have to do it in a collaborative way. If we don't do that, it just simply won't happen. And that collaboration in terms of how we make decision-making happen, I think, is a really critical component that is driven by that psychological desire for choice and collaborating with each other. Now, I touched on this earlier on, but asynchronous infrastructure is really important here. And what I mean by this is being able to access any piece of information from anywhere at any time. Okay, this has been a huge change in companies in recent years, where typically you'd have to be in the office or dialed up into the crappy VPN that you've got access to, and it work, or even worse, dialing into a remote Windows desktop. We need to access our tools and information electronically. And GitHub and GitLab has helped a lot with this. And part of the reason why this is important is it doesn't just allow you to work from anywhere, but it also builds a history that people can learn from. You can see how decisions were made. And again, this taps into that ability and that desire to be able to collaborate and to have choice. Number 3. Now, I touched on this a little bit earlier with my story about the kid in Africa, but our work needs to have meaning. And I think this is, I think, one of the most fundamental elements of why this is important. Again, Dan Ariely, he told a story once of a guy who was given a task to work on a presentation for a merger between his company and another company. And he spent hours working on this PowerPoint deck. And he invested so much time and energy in formulating everything so it was perfect. He was working late. He was sleeping at the office. His family didn't see him. And yeah, it was a lot of work, but he loved it. He felt like he was playing a big role in this big merger. It was satisfying from a career perspective. And then he got it ready, sent it to his boss, and his boss said, you did a really good job, but the merger's off. It's canceled. And he was devastated. And even though he had a great time making this merger PowerPoint deck, which sounds like the most boring thing on the planet to me, he had a great time. He was incredibly depressed because his work didn't have any impact anymore. And I think this is one of the elements that's really critical to us, is that we do work that has some kind of meaning. We were in a taxi last night, going back to we were in the same hotel, and we were talking about, it's unsatisfying to do work that fundamentally just kind of optimizes two specific things. Is that we want to do work that makes people more efficient or more things more rewarding for people and how people collaborate together. And I think everybody in this room will share that particular perspective. So when we think about how all of these groups work together, that output and how we tie that to meaningful work is really important. The companies, the communities, the people that succeed are able to inspire people around that work having meaning. What's critical in how we think about this is that when you're inspiring people, there's substance to it. There's a lot of people out there who will do these big inspirational moonshot thinking talks and will speak in these generalisms, but then you can't tie that to actually doing something that's real. So if we're inspiring but in a way that's actually delivering something, you've hit the jackpot. That meaningful piece is critical. Now, I actually think that this taps into something that's even more intrinsic in how we operate. And this again gets back to us being animals and the psychology of how we tend to operate, which is fundamentally where we all want to get to is a state of belonging, right? So I've only been here this morning for a couple of hours, and I've already heard so many stories about people loving the DevOpsDays community, because you feel like you're part of something. People are here because you see old friends and you meet new friends, and this is a space where everybody here belongs, right? We all do similar kinds of work, we've got similar interests, similar problems, and we belong. When you have that sense of belonging in a company, in a family, in a community, it builds a level of retention and commitment that will last years. But to get there, it all starts with access. You need to have access to the tools, the technology, the information that you need to contribute something that's useful. So again, in the technology sense, that's often something such as a pull request. And when you repeatedly contribute, you tend to build this sense of self-respect. And self-respect is really important because what it does is it builds confidence in how we tend to operate and how we tend to think. So when you start building that and contributing and building that sense of self-respect, that builds a sense of dignity. Now, dignity fundamentally and psychologically is a sense of inner peace, right? So outside of DevOps, all of you will have different things that you're dealing with at work, in your family, that are going to be challenging, that are going to be fun, that are going to be rewarding in different ways. But we all want to feel a sense of dignity. And then what happens is when we have that sense of dignity, we feel like we can have an impact. We can come up with new ideas. It gives us the confidence to kind of try new and bigger things. And that's what builds that sense of belonging. So that's where we need to get to. As you think about how you work together with your colleagues, with your friends, look at that and think, how do I inject that into every step of the process? The worst thing that you can do is only look at the technology and the workflow that you're building and forget these fundamental human things that are baked into it. Because otherwise, all you're doing is you're moving bits around. And when we can tap into that psychology, you'll get just exponentially better results. All right, number 4, we respond well to incentives and rewards. Now, this is not particularly surprising, right? All of you, well, I'm guessing the majority of you have a job, and what happens is you go to work and you do something and they give you money. And sometimes they'll give you bonuses. Sometimes they'll give you stock. Sometimes there'll be beer at the office, right? So what you do is you give something and you get something. We see incentives and rewards all over the place. It's the reason why we fly with the same airline, because we get free air miles. It's the reason why when you go to a coffee shop, the same coffee shop over and over again, and they stamp. They stamp your card, and then you buy 10 coffees, you get a free one. Okay, we're incentivized. When we're incentivized in the right way, it triggers the kind of behavior that we want to see. Now, there's 2 types of incentives. Incentives is really difficult because if you get it wrong, people are going to game it, right? I'm not sure if any of you remember this, but years ago, when forums became a thing, you'd have this situation where if you posted 500 things, then you'd get a new badge. If you posted 1,000 things, you get an even better badge. And people use this as a means to kind of increase their status, which I'll talk about in a second. What happened is people just posted a load of just nonsense to the forum, and so they could get that thing. So when you use any kind of numbers to trigger human behavior, people will try and cheat, and there'll be shortcuts around it. Dan Ariely wrote a fantastic book on this that you should check out. I tend to think of incentives in one of two ways, and we can think about this in anything to do with DevOps, right? Stated and submarine. Now, stated incentives are where you say, if you do this thing, you will get this thing. So a good example of that is your job. If you do this, we will give you this much money, and you might get this much stock, or whatever it might be. And it's stipulated competitions, hackathons, all of this kind of stuff is a stated incentive. Now, a submarine incentive is where this to me is the really fun stuff. And this is where you basically wire into your community or into your company or project or whatever a means of being able to measure the desired behavior that you want, so you can then send people some kind of personal message. Now, I know that sounds a bit abstract, so let me give you an example. One of the big problems with communities that I've learned over the years, I don't have this in a slide, is that you see this graph that tends to go up, right? And people start participating, and the number of people that will contribute in your community grows. Now, that's great, because everybody wants to see that hockey stick. The problem with that is that as a community grows, the level of personal attention that you get tends to drop. If you have a community or a company of 10 people, you can basically know everybody and be able to have a personal relationship with everybody. When you get to 1,000 people or 10,000 people, it becomes exponentially more complicated to develop those personal relationships. The reason why companies often succeed is because they build that sense of personal commitment, and the reason why communities succeed is because they have a sense of personal commitment. So we need to figure out, how do we stay personal while also your community is growing? Submarine incentives help with this, because what happens is you determine what's the kind of behavior you want to see. So for example, if you want to encourage someone to submit their first pull request, and you've got 10,000 people in your community, if you can detect that first pull request, you can then send them a personal message, right? So never, ever, ever, ever send an automated message. People don't like getting thanked by computers. It's weird. It's like something from a Stanley Kubrick movie. It's awful. If you do that, retire immediately. But if we detect these conditions, so as an example, one company I work with, generally, when people have contributed about 5 to 7 times, they've got the hang of how to do it, but they're starting to get a bit bored. That's a good time when you should incentivize and reward someone. So what happens is, when they contribute we had a thing where it would detect their 5th or their 7th contribution, and then we'd detect that and we'd send them a personal email saying, hey, love the work that you're doing, think it's fantastic. Here's we'd love to send you a t-shirt. And the response that got was incredible, because people would think, they noticed what I did? That's phenomenal. And you got a personal email from somebody. You didn't get thanked by a computer. It was incredibly rewarding. So there's nothing wrong with detecting the right behavioral conditions. What's most important is that you send someone that personal message. I just got a reward for that sentence. Now, the other side of an incentive is a reward, right? And a lot of open source people like to kind of portray themselves as, I'm in this for making a better world of technology, man. I'm doing this because it's the right thing, And the vast majority of people on the planet respond, they do something to get something, right? There are some people out there who will do something to get nothing, and that's fantastic, and I applaud those people, but that model doesn't scale. That's the reason why there's a lot of people struggle to hire in charities, because they want the big pay packet and whatever else. So there's 2 types of rewards we should think about. And again, this taps into the psychology of how we think. The first type is called an extrinsic reward. And this is the kind of stuff that you get mailed to you, right? It's physical items, it's t-shirts, it's challenge coins, not command coins. Challenge coins, these are awesome, these little coins. that you can design, that you send to people, you can mail them in the post. They're fantastic. It's trophies, it's stickers. When I worked with HackerOne, our top-rated hackers in the company, in the community, we'd actually commission a comic book cover of them. And there's a lot of ego in hackers, so they loved it, and we'd sign it, from everyone in the company. So these things are great. The problem with these things is that they're expensive, and a lot of people, if you send the wrong thing, it will just seem like a gimmick. So, for example, when I've sent, one community that I work with, they sent me a branded speaker, this not particularly good Bluetooth speaker with their logo stamped on it. And it just annoyed me, because I thought, first of all, I'm not going to use this. And secondly, I can't give it away. I can't re-gift it. It's got this stupid community logo on the front of it. So then it just sits there in my closet, and then eventually I'll donate it to some charity, and then there's going to be some kid in Ethiopia who's going to be listening to music through this awful Bluetooth speaker. So you got to gift the right kinds of things. What's important to me is that the intrinsic rewards that you give are the most important thing that you should start with, because intrinsic rewards are where you are validated. What I mentioned earlier on is that people appreciate what you do. This can be as simple as a thank you email. It could be a blog post highlighting the work that you've done. It could be you being thanked in a social media setting. It could be being invited to an event or a meetup. It could be, one thing I'm a big fan of is when people are doing great work in a community or an organization, is inviting them to come and talk to the executive team and get the executive team to listen to them. Let them share their feedback and their insight. You can go even a step further. One company I work with as a client, their top-rated community members, we gave them a direct phone number to the executive team and an email address. It was like a bat phone that they could contact them. They never used it, ever, but they loved the fact that it was there. Referrals. Referrals are the strongest means of adding value in any scenario. Like almost all of my clients come from referrals. And testimonials, being able to provide a testimonial for someone if they're going for a job or if they're writing a book or whatever else. So start with the intrinsic and then expand into the extrinsic. You've got to be very careful with the extrinsic, because you tend to get this thing happen. There's this concept called the Yerkes-Dodson scale, which was a study into the impact of arousal. Now, I'm not just talking about kind of sexual arousal. I'm talking about when you're excited about anything. Right? It could be the arousal that you experience just before a band goes on stage. You're really excited because the lights go down, whatever it might be. One of the things that they found here was that maps to this is the more stuff you give people, at some point, people will care more about the stuff than contributing. So what happens is they don't particularly necessarily, they just figure out what's the minimum that I can do to get the really cool swag sent to me. And you've got to try and figure out how to get to the top of that scale. So don't over-reward people, because then psychologically you build this weird dependency, and then they get really annoyed when you don't send them the stuff anymore. All right, fifth one. Status and teamwork matter. Now, there's this notion that we have in the technology world that I don't care about my job title. That's what we tell people. I went for this new job, but I don't really care about the job title. I just want to do really good work. You liar. Everybody cares about their job title. The reality is that it's not socially acceptable to tell people that you care about your job title. Status is something that we all care about, because we're fundamentally social animals. And if you look at, for example, dogs who organize themselves into packs, there's always like the alpha dog. There's the lead dog. And one thing that people say when you get a new dog is you have to show that dog who's boss. You need to be the pack leader. Otherwise, that dog is going to ruin your life repeatedly. And it's the same thing in any kind of social circle. There's a power dynamic that happens in every single room. And there's a status dynamic that happens in every single room. It's happening right now. I'm delivering a keynote, right? So my status has been elevated in this room. In reality, it doesn't matter. I'm just another human being. I'm no different to any of you folks. But because I'm stood on the stage right now talking to you, it sealed a power dynamic in that, I'm slightly elevated because I'm stood talking to you, and that's probably completely unfounded. But that's what happens in every social scenario. We're going to get it with all of the other speakers. We're going to see it with the organizers of this event. You get a power dynamic, for example, when you go into a job interview and the person on the other side of the table is interviewing you. That's the person who's got the power. This has been a real struggle, for example, that's historically impacted women in technology, underrepresented groups in technology, because that power dynamic has often been unfairly seated. So what we can do to harness this psychological pattern is use status in a way that actually helps mentor and drive people in the right direction. And this is very closely related to teamwork. So, I'm going to go back to an example earlier on with HackerOne, which is when people would rise to the top of a leaderboard, it kind of sealed their status in the community because it's fundamentally based upon merit. But the only reason why this works is because the calculation for that status is based upon reputation, which is calculated based upon what they've actually done. So if people submit a good report, they get 7 points. If they submit an awful report, they get -7 points. And there's a graduation in there. So you knew that the people at the top have earned it. If we just arbitrarily said, these 10 people, they're the best, that's not good. That's how you get despotic regimes, okay? So it's really important that status is reflected on actual delivery in an objective way that takes into account the variances and the diversity of the people who are in your community. But status is something we can harness. We can harness it in the leaders that we have in our open source projects, in committers, or in leaders that we have in governance in open source projects. When I was at Canonical, we had a very, very expansive open source governance methodology in Ubuntu. We had like 2 governance boards and sub-councils because the community was so large. And those people earned those spots. Now, earlier on, I showed this onboarding, and the way in which I think you can think about status, and this is how I tend to think about it, is when somebody joins a community, they enter through 3 different transitions. They start out as casual participants, and then as they become more regular in their participation, they demonstrate what my old boss at Canonical, Mark Shuttleworth, who founded Ubuntu, he would say significant and sustained contributions. Then they become regulars, and then you get a very small proportion of people that become your rock stars, who are just obsessed about doing great work in that community. In every 100 people, generally about 10 people will be your regulars, and about 1 of those people will be your core. What's really important to me is that you design your company, your community, whatever, where people to the right mentor people to the left. So your core people should be mentoring your regulars and your casual. Your regulars should be mentoring your casual. Because then what happens is you build status, where the people who rise in status, you put them to work as mentors. And that's how you build scale in the community. Now, the other element here as well around teamwork is building a sense of team culture. There's a guy called Dr. David Rock. He did a study into kind of common principles in human beings, which was actually based upon research in animals. And he found relatedness was a key element of this, which is we segment ourselves into different teams, such as you've got marketing people, sales people, developers, ops, and there's cultural components of that. So for example, this was my team at Canonical, and we focused a lot on team culture. When there was 4 of us, we called ourselves the 4 Horsemen, because the other guy was a huge Metallica fan, as am I, and they have a song called the 4 Horsemen. We realized when the 5th person joined that, you have war, pestilence, I forget the other 2 in the 4 Horsemen. Famine. We couldn't figure out the 5th one, so he became traffic lights. But we focused a lot on our unity as a team, and it helped build a huge amount of commitment with everybody in the team, not just my team. So how do we put this stuff into action? I want to wrap it up. These behavioral economics principles are fascinating, I think, because it gives us an insight into how we just unilaterally think and operate. Everything that you do for the next 2 days is going to be driven by that system 1 thinking in your brain. But how do we take that and build better things based upon those psychological principles? There's only one way to do it, is you have to have a theory about something. So you could say, okay, we need to build status, for example, in our open source project. So you have a theory, you hypothesize something, and then you have to do a very, very simple, thin experiment to test it. And then based upon the results of that, you optimize your overall project or community based upon that. If you go and read one of those books that I mentioned earlier on, it's not going to give you a blueprint for how to apply this in a DevOps world. It's just not going to happen. But this is where the fun can happen, right? When you're around here today and tomorrow, talk about these principles. And talk to some of your colleagues, your friends, your fellow community members, and say, like, what do you think this means for our project? And how could we test it? in the same way that marketing people will test things and they'll track it in Google Analytics, or you'll do A/B testing. And then what you do is you optimize based upon that. The key thing here, and this is where I'm going to wrap up, is that it's been scientifically proven that to build any change in anything, if you decide you want to work out and get fit, or stop smoking, or stop drinking, or whatever it might be, it takes about 66 days to build a habit. So if you are able to stick at something for 66 days, it stops becoming something you have to think about, and it starts becoming something that's just natural in what you do. I'm an example of this. When I moved to the US, I hated exercising. I don't like it. I much prefer drinking gin and tonics. My wife is an absolute exercise fiend, and I said, I'll do it for 66 days, and now I love exercising. It's just part of how I operate. So when you hypothesize those things, you experiment, you put them into action, try and focus on getting people to pick up those different principles and having them stick for 66 days, and then you get something that is pretty valuable. So that's me about done. I write a lot about community management and strategy and various other things. Feel free to go to my website, go to this link, jonobacon.com/join, where I mail a lot of this stuff out. If this is interesting to you, feel free to sign up. I won't spam you. I will not sell your information to other people, I promise you. All right. Thank you, everyone.